3 words changed her life forever. But the man who heard them was someone her father should have feared. "You'll never amount to anything." The words were spat across a crowded auto repair shop, loud enough for every mechanic, every customer, and every passerby outside to hear. But what Elena Rossi's father didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that the man standing quietly near the doorway, listening to every word, was Marco Bellini, the most powerful mafia boss in the city. And Marco Bellini never forgot an insult, especially when it was aimed at someone who didn't deserve it. The afternoon sun poured through the dusty windows of Rossi's auto garage, turning the floating particles of oil and smoke into glittering specks in the air. The place smelled like gasoline, rubber, and years of hard labor. Engines were half disassembled across metal workbenches. Radios crackled with old music, and the steady clanging of tools echoed through the building. Elena stood near the entrance, clutching a worn sketchbook against her chest, her fingers smudged with pencil graphite. She had come to show her father something important, something she had spent weeks working on, but now she was beginning to regret it. Her father, Antonio Rossi, stood beside a raised pickup truck, wiping grease from his hands with a dirty rack. He was a big man with thick arms hardened by decades of manual work, the kind of man who believed life was simple. You worked, you survived, and dreams were for fools. "What's that you're holding?" he asked gruffly, noticing the sketchbook. Elena hesitated, then slowly stepped forward. It's something I've been working on," she said quietly. "A design." Antonio raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Around them, 3 other mechanics glanced over with curiosity. One of them leaned against a tool chest, already smiling as if he knew this conversation wouldn't end well. Elena opened the sketchbook carefully, revealing a detailed architectural drawing that filled the entire page. It showed a modern waterfront building with sweeping glass walls, layered terraces, and a rooftop garden overlooking the harbor. Every line was precise, every shadow carefully shaded. It wasn't just a drawing, it was a vision. "It's a community center," Elena explained nervously. "I designed it for the empty lot near the marina. I thought maybe someday." Antonio snatched the sketchbook from her hands before she could finish. He studied the page for 2 seconds before letting out a harsh laugh. "You spend your time on this," he said loudly. The other mechanics chuckled. Elena felt her stomach tighten. "I want to apply to architecture school," she said quickly, trying to keep her voice steady. "My teacher says I have a real chance if I—" Antonio slammed the sketchbook shut. "Architecture school," he repeated as if the words themselves were ridiculous. "You think you're going to be some kind of fancy architect?" The mechanics laughed again, louder this time. Elena felt heat creeping up her neck, but forced herself not to look down. "I've been studying," she said softly. "I've been practicing every night after work. I just thought if you saw what?" Antonio interrupted. "A bunch of drawings?" He flipped through the pages mockingly, revealing dozens of buildings, bridges, and city blocks Elena had carefully sketched over the past year. "This is a waste of time." He tossed the book onto a greasy workbench. "You should be focusing on something real." Elena's hands trembled slightly. "It is real." Antonio turned to the other men in the shop. "You hear this?" he said with a grin. "My daughter thinks she's going to design buildings." One of the mechanics shook his head dramatically. "Maybe she'll design us a new garage," he joked. More laughter erupted. Elena's chest tightened with humiliation, but she stayed where she was, refusing to run. Outside the garage, a sleek black car had just pulled into the alley beside the building. The engine shut off quietly, and a man stepped out. He wore a dark tailored suit that contrasted sharply with the gritty surroundings of the garage. His shoes were polished, his hair perfectly combed, and his expression calm, almost unreadable. Marco Bellini had come to the garage for a private meeting with a business contact. But as he approached the open doorway, the raised voices inside caught his attention. He paused just outside the entrance, listening. Inside, Antonio Rossi folded his arms and looked directly at his daughter. "Listen to me carefully," he said, his voice louder now, echoing through the garage. "You're not going to college. You're not going to be an architect. You'll never amount to anything with this nonsense." The words landed like a hammer. For a moment, the garage went quiet except for the distant ticking of a cooling engine. Elena felt something inside her crack, but she refused to cry. "Not here. Not in front of them. Your mother waited tables her whole life," Antonio continued. "And that's probably where you'll end up too." Maybe if you're lucky. The men snickered again. Elena slowly walked to the workbench and picked up her sketchbook. Her fingers brushed the edges of the pages she had poured so many late nights into. She closed the book gently and held it close to her chest. "Okay," she whispered. Antonio waved a dismissive hand. "Good. Now stop wasting my time." Elena turned and walked toward the door, her head down, her heart pounding in her ears. She passed through the doorway without noticing the tall man standing just outside. Marco Bellini stepped aside silently to let her pass. As she walked away down the street, he noticed something fall from her sketchbook, a single loose page fluttering to the pavement behind her. Marco bent down and picked it up. It was another drawing. This one showed an elegant bridge stretching across a river, its cables forming a perfect geometric pattern against the sky. Marco studied it for several seconds. The lines were confident, the proportions flawless. Whoever had drawn this didn't just have talent. They had vision. Behind him, the mechanics inside the garage had already returned to work, laughing and talking as if nothing important had happened. Marco looked back toward the street where Elena was walking away, her shoulders slightly hunched, her sketchbook clutched tightly against her chest. For the first time in years, Marco Bellini felt something unexpected stir in his chest. Curiosity. Because in his world, he had seen countless people claim greatness and fail. But every once in a while, he met someone the world had underestimated, and the world often regretted that mistake. Marco folded the drawing carefully and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Then he turned toward the garage door and stepped inside, his dark eyes calm and thoughtful. Antonio Rossi had just humiliated his daughter in front of a room full of men. What Antonio Rossi didn't realize was that someone far more powerful than anyone in that garage had just witnessed the entire thing. And Marco Bellini was already beginning to think about what to do next. The next morning, Elena Rossi woke up with the same heavy feeling she had gone to sleep with. Her father's words from the garage echoed in her mind like a cruel reminder she couldn't escape. "You'll never amount to anything." The humiliation still burned. She sat on the edge of her bed with her sketchbook open across her lap, slowly turning the pages filled with buildings she had imagined for years. Towers, bridges, parks, and waterfront designs, each drawing the result of long nights spent practicing after work. For so long those pages had been her escape, proof that maybe her life could become something bigger than the small apartment and the mechanic shop where her father worked. But now, for the first time, doubt had started creeping in. Maybe he was right. Maybe dreams like hers were meant for other people. People with money, connections, and families who believed in them. Elena sighed and closed the sketchbook gently. Across the city, however, someone else was thinking about those drawings very differently. Inside a large office overlooking the downtown skyline, Marco Bellini sat behind his desk studying the loose sketch he had picked up outside the garage the day before. The bridge design lay flat in front of him, every line sharp and confident. Marco had built an empire through construction, real estate, and business deals that most people would never hear about. He had worked with famous architects and developers from around the world. But something about this simple pencil drawing had caught his attention immediately. It wasn't amateur work. It showed instinct, balance, vision, something you couldn't fake or learn overnight. Marco leaned back in his chair, still staring at the page. "Find out everything about the girl who drew this," he told the man standing across the room. His assistant Victor nodded. "Elena Rossi," he replied. "The girl from the garage yesterday." Marco said nothing for a moment, then nodded slowly. By the afternoon, Victor had gathered the details. Elena was 17, one of the top students in her school, especially in mathematics and art. Her architecture teacher believed she had exceptional talent, but her family barely had enough money to get by, and according to the reports, her father had never supported her plans for college. Marco closed the folder quietly. In his world, he had seen many people claim they had talent, but real talent was rare, and when he recognized it, he paid attention. That evening, Elena finished her shift at the small cafe where she worked part-time and slowly walked home. The sky was turning orange as the sun set behind the buildings, but she barely noticed. Her mind was still stuck in the garage, replaying the laughter of the mechanics and the look of disappointment on her father's face. When she reached the front door of her apartment building, she noticed something unusual. A white envelope had been taped to the door with her name written neatly across the front. Confused, she pulled it off and opened it carefully. Inside was a letter printed on official stationery. Elena read the first line once, then again, just to make sure she hadn't misunderstood. Miss Elena Rossi, you have been awarded a full academic scholarship to the Milan Institute of Architecture and Design. Her heart skipped a beat. The letter explained that the scholarship covered tuition, housing, and living expenses for the entire program. It was everything she would have needed to become an architect, everything she had secretly dreamed about, but never believed she could actually afford. At the bottom of the page, one line stood out, awarded for exceptional creative potential. Elena slowly sat down on the apartment steps, staring at the letter in disbelief. She had never even submitted an application to this school. She had never sent them her drawings. She had no idea how they could possibly know about her. Across the city, Marco Bellini stood near the window of his office, looking down at the glowing lights beginning to appear across the skyline. Victor stepped into the room. The scholarship arrangements are done, he said. Marco nodded calmly. Good. She'll never know it came from you, Victor added. Marco watched the city quietly for a moment before responding. She doesn't need to. Victor studied him with mild curiosity. You usually invest in things that bring profit. Marco allowed a faint smile to appear. Sometimes, he said slowly, the most valuable investments are the ones the world almost ignores. Somewhere across that same city, Elena Rossi was still sitting on the apartment stairs holding the letter that had just changed her future, completely unaware that the man responsible for it had been standing quietly in a garage the day before when her father said she would never amount to anything. And Marco Bellini had already decided he would make sure those words were proven wrong. 10 years later, the city gathered along the waterfront for the grand opening of its most ambitious development project in decades. Glass towers reflected the sunlight, parks stretched along the harbor, and at the center stood a stunning modern building that was already being called one of the most innovative architectural designs in Europe. Hundreds of people filled the plaza, reporters, city officials, investors, and curious residents. Near the back of the crowd stood a man in worn work boots and an old jacket, staring at the stage in disbelief. Antonio Rossi had come because someone from the garage mentioned the project on the news. When he saw the name of the lead architect, he thought it had to be a mistake. But now, as the announcer stepped up to the microphone, the truth became impossible to ignore. Ladies and gentlemen, the announcer said, smiling toward the audience, please welcome the architect behind the Harbor Renewal Project, Elena Rossi. The crowd burst into applause as Elena walked onto the stage. She stood tall and confident, nothing like the quiet girl who once stood in a greasy garage holding a sketchbook while her father laughed at her dreams. Years of study, dedication, and talent had brought her here. Antonio watched silently, his chest tight as he heard people around him praising her work, talking about how her designs were transforming cities across Europe. Elena spoke briefly, thanking the engineers and planners who helped bring the project to life. But just as she finished, another man stepped onto the stage beside her. A quiet ripple moved through the crowd as people recognized him immediately. Marco Bellini. Even after all these years, his name still carried power. Marco stood beside Elena and looked out at the audience before speaking. 10 years ago, he said calmly, this entire project existed only as a pencil sketch. Elena glanced at him with a small smile. Marco continued, his voice steady. Sometimes the world overlooks extraordinary talent simply because it appears in unexpected places. As he said that, his eyes briefly moved toward the back of the crowd, toward Antonio Rossi. Antonio felt his stomach drop. Marco returned his gaze to the audience. But every once in a while, he finished quietly, someone believes in that talent before anyone else does. The crowd applauded again. Elena looked out across the plaza and finally saw her father standing there among the spectators. For a moment, everything felt still. She didn't show anger or resentment. Instead, she simply gave him a calm nod, silent proof that the words he once said had been wrong. Completely wrong. Antonio lowered his eyes, overwhelmed with regret. And on stage, Marco Bellini allowed himself a faint smile. Because the greatest investment he had ever made wasn't in buildings or businesses. It was in the girl everyone once said would never become anything, who had just proven them all wrong.